Whoopi Goldberg's voice echoed through the View studio as she called Lauren Boebert uneducated and dangerous and claimed she doesn't have the critical thinking skills to be in Congress. Whoopi's liberal audience loved these moments of elite condescension, but she had picked the wrong target this time. Boebert had been waiting for this moment, armed with Whoopi's history of defending pedophiles, Holocaust controversies, and Hollywood hypocrisy. What happened next would expose Whoopi as the ultimate moral fraud and end her credibility forever. The View studio was buzzing with anticipation on this particular Thursday morning in New York City. The iconic daytime talk show set, with its colorful backdrop and comfortable chairs arranged around the familiar curved table, had hosted countless political debates over the years. But what was about to unfold would become one of the most explosive confrontations in television history. The show had invited Lauren Boebert as a guest to discuss her role in Congress and her perspectives on current political issues. It was supposed to be a routine interview, the kind of political discussion that The View had built its brand on for over 2 decades. The producers expected some fireworks, as they always did when conservative guests appeared on the famously liberal show, but no one anticipated the nuclear explosion that was about to occur. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her familiar position as moderator, her presence commanding the set with the authority that came from years of hosting one of television's most influential talk shows. She wore her signature style, casual but polished, her hair in locks, her expression carrying that mixture of world-weary wisdom and barely contained contempt for conservative viewpoints that had made her a hero to progressives nationwide. Whoopi had built her career on speaking truth to power, or at least her version of the truth. From her days as a groundbreaking comedian to her Oscar-winning acting career to her current role as the moral arbiter of daytime television, she had positioned herself as someone who wasn't afraid to call out what she saw as ignorance, hatred, and dangerous thinking. The other co-hosts sat in their usual positions around the table, ready to pile on when Whoopi gave them the signal. The audience was filled with the usual mix of New York liberals who had come to see their heroes take down another conservative politician. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Lauren Boebert sat across from Whoopi, wearing a simple navy blazer, her demeanor calm but alert. She had appeared on hostile media before, but The View represented a particular challenge. This wasn't a news interview, where journalistic standards might impose some limits on personal attacks. This was entertainment television, where anything could happen and usually did. The interview had started routinely enough, with questions about Boebert's background and her positions on various issues. But everyone in the studio could sense that Whoopi was building up to something bigger. The questions were becoming more pointed, more personal, more designed to embarrass than to inform. "Now, Lauren," Whoopi said, her voice taking on that familiar tone of barely disguised contempt, "I have to ask you about some of the statements you've made, some of the positions you've taken. Because, frankly, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing from you and some of your colleagues in Congress." The setup was classic Whoopi, positioning herself as the voice of reason confronting dangerous extremism. The audience murmured its approval, ready for their hero to deliver another devastating takedown of conservative ignorance. "I'm looking at your voting record, I'm looking at your public statements, and I have to say, I'm seeing a pattern of behavior that frankly scares me," Whoopi continued, her voice growing more intense. "I'm seeing someone who seems to be more interested in creating controversy than in actually governing." Boebert remained calm, her hands folded in her lap, her expression attentive but untroubled. She had been expecting this kind of attack, and she was prepared for it. "You've made statements about election integrity that have been thoroughly debunked," Whoopi pressed on, her voice rising with indignation. "You've promoted conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact. You've aligned yourself with groups and individuals that most Americans would consider extremist." The accusations were becoming more serious, more personal, and the audience was eating it up. They had come to see a conservative politician get destroyed on live television, and Whoopi was delivering exactly what they wanted. "And what really bothers me, Lauren," Whoopi said, leaning forward in her chair, her voice taking on that signature tone of moral authority, "is that you seem to be completely immune to facts, completely resistant to evidence, completely unwilling to acknowledge when you're wrong." The attack was building to its crescendo, and everyone in the studio could feel the tension ratcheting up. Whoopi was preparing to deliver what she clearly believed would be the killing blow. "So I have to ask you directly," Whoopi said, her voice echoing through the studio with righteous fury. "What makes you think you have the qualifications to be making decisions that affect millions of Americans? What makes you think you have the critical thinking skills necessary to serve in Congress?" She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in before delivering the final assault. "Because frankly, from where I sit, you're uneducated and dangerous. You don't have the intellectual capacity to understand the complexity of the issues you're supposed to be addressing. You're spreading misinformation, you're promoting conspiracy theories, and you're contributing to the dumbing down of American political discourse." The audience erupted in applause, and Whoopi sat back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a devastating blow. She had used her platform to paint Boebert as an ignorant extremist who had no business being in Congress, and she expected Boebert to either remain silent or offer some weak defense that would only make Whoopi look stronger. But what Whoopi didn't realize was that she had just made a fatal miscalculation. She had assumed that her celebrity status and her platform would be enough to intimidate someone she clearly viewed as an intellectual inferior. She had no idea that she was about to confront someone who had done her homework on Whoopi's own history of controversial statements and moral failures. "Whoopi," Boebert said, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the studio pay attention. "I appreciate your concern about education and critical thinking. I really do. But I have to ask you something, and I think your audience deserves to hear your answer." The tone of the conversation was shifting, and Whoopi's confident expression began to falter slightly. She had expected Boebert to crumble under the weight of her attack, not to turn the tables and go on the offensive. "You just lectured me about the importance of facts and evidence," Boebert continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You criticized me for supposedly spreading misinformation and promoting dangerous ideas. You questioned my intellectual capacity and my moral judgment." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Whoopi, what gives you the moral authority to lecture anyone about dangerous ideas or poor judgment? What in your own history qualifies you to be the arbiter of who is educated enough or moral enough to serve in Congress?" The question hit the studio like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these interviews were supposed to go. Conservative guests were supposed to be defensive, apologetic, easily intimidated by Whoopi's moral authority. "Because when I look at your own history," Boebert continued, her voice carrying across the studio with unmistakable authority, "I see a pattern of statements and positions that raise serious questions about your own judgment and moral compass." She pulled out a document from her folder, and the gesture was both theatrical and ominous. "Let's start with your defense of Roman Polanski. For those in your audience who might not remember, Roman Polanski is a film director who pled guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a 13-year-old girl. He drugged and raped a child, Whoopi." The studio was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from celebration to shocked attention. Whoopi sat rigid in her chair, her earlier confidence evaporating as she realized where this was heading. "But you, Whoopi, you went on television and said it wasn't rape. Those were your exact words. You minimized the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl by a powerful Hollywood figure. You used your platform to defend a confessed child rapist." The revelation was devastating, and everyone in the studio could feel the energy completely shift. The audience that had been cheering Whoopi's attack on Boebert was now sitting in stunned silence, confronted with their hero's defense of child sexual assault. "So when you lecture me about dangerous ideas," Boebert continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation, "remember that you used national television to minimize the rape of a child. When you question my moral judgment, remember that you defended a pedophile because he was part of your Hollywood elite circle." The attack was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental hypocrisy of Whoopi's moral positioning. How could someone who had defended child sexual assault credibly lecture others about moral authority? "But that's not all," Boebert said, consulting her notes. "Let's talk about your comments about the Holocaust. You said that the Holocaust wasn't about race, that it was about man's inhumanity to man. You literally minimized the systematic genocide of Jewish people by the Nazi regime. The audience was shifting uncomfortably now, many looking shocked and confused. These were not the kind of facts they had expected to hear about their progressive hero. The Holocaust was absolutely about race, Whoopi Goldberg continued, her voice carrying the weight of historical truth. It was about Nazi racial ideology, about the belief that Jewish people were subhuman, about systematic racial extermination. Your attempt to minimize that racial component was not just wrong, it was dangerous. She looked directly at Whoopi, whose face had gone pale. So when you lecture me about spreading misinformation, remember that you spread misinformation about one of history's greatest atrocities. When you question my understanding of facts, remember that you got basic historical facts wrong about the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people. The room was completely silent now, the weight of these revelations settling over everyone present. This wasn't just political disagreement anymore. This was a fundamental exposure of moral hypocrisy. And let's talk about your pattern of defending the indefensible, Boebert continued, her momentum building. You defended Michael Vick after his dog-fighting conviction. You defended Mel Gibson after his anti-Semitic rants. You consistently use your platform to protect powerful men who have done terrible things, as long as they're part of your Hollywood circle. The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a picture of someone whose moral compass was entirely determined by celebrity loyalty rather than actual principles. You called me uneducated, Boebert said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. But let me tell you about my education. I got my education in the real world, working real jobs, serving real customers, building a real business. I learned about responsibility by actually being responsible for something other than my own opinion. She gestured around the studio. What's your education in real-world responsibility, Whoopi? You've spent decades in Hollywood, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, making millions of dollars for expressing opinions on television. When was the last time you had to make payroll? When was the last time you had to worry about keeping a business afloat? The contrast was stark and undeniable. Here was Boebert, who had actually built something in the real world, being lectured about competence by someone whose only qualification was celebrity status. You questioned my critical thinking skills, Boebert continued, but let's examine your own critical thinking. You thought it was a good idea to defend a child rapist on national television. You thought it was appropriate to minimize the Holocaust. You thought it was wise to consistently defend powerful men who abuse their positions. She looked around the studio, making eye contact with audience members. Is that the kind of critical thinking you want to hold up as an example? Is that the kind of moral judgment you think qualifies someone to lecture elected officials? The questions were devastating because they highlighted the fundamental absurdity of Whoopi's position. How could someone with such a history of moral failures credibly attack others for their judgment? But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Whoopi, Boebert said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. You use your platform to attack people who actually have to face voters, who actually have to be accountable to constituents, who actually have to live with the consequences of the policies they support. She leaned forward slightly. Meanwhile, you face no accountability whatsoever. You can say whatever you want, defend whoever you want, promote whatever ideas you want, and you never have to face any real consequences. You just collect your paycheck and move on to the next controversy. The distinction between democratic accountability and celebrity privilege was becoming clear, and it exposed the fundamental illegitimacy of Whoopi's moral authority. You live in a bubble, Whoopi, Boebert continued, her voice growing stronger. You're surrounded by people who agree with you, who profit from the same system you do, who share your elite perspective on the world. You have no idea what life is like for the millions of Americans who work real jobs, face real challenges, and need real solutions to real problems. The attack on elite insularity was particularly effective because it highlighted how disconnected Hollywood celebrities were from the concerns of ordinary Americans. And yet you feel qualified to lecture those of us who actually represent those Americans, Boebert said, her voice rising with conviction. You feel entitled to judge our qualifications, our intelligence, our moral standing. Based on what? Based on your ability to read from a teleprompter? Based on your success at playing pretend for a living? The dismissal of celebrity expertise was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental absurdity of taking political advice from entertainers. Let me tell you what qualifies me to serve in Congress, Boebert continued, her voice reflecting both humility and confidence. I was chosen by the voters in my district. I campaigned on specific issues, I made specific promises, and I'm held accountable for keeping those promises every day. She gestured toward Whoopi. What qualifies you to judge my performance? Who elected you to anything? Who holds you accountable when you're wrong? Who suffers the consequences when your opinions turn out to be misguided? The questions highlighted the fundamental democratic illegitimacy of celebrity political commentary. Elected officials faced voters. Celebrities faced only ratings. You called me dangerous, Boebert said, her voice taking on a more intense tone. But let's talk about what's really dangerous. What's dangerous is a media culture that gives platforms to people who defend child rapists and minimize genocide. What's dangerous is celebrity culture that protects powerful predators and silences their victims. She looked directly into the camera. What's dangerous is allowing entertainers who live in gated communities and travel with security details to lecture working Americans about what's best for their families and their communities. The broader critique of celebrity political influence was powerful because it resonated with millions of Americans who were tired of being lectured by Hollywood elites. You want to know what I find truly uneducated, Whoopi? Boebert asked, her voice reaching a crescendo. I find it uneducated to defend a man who drugged and raped a 13-year-old girl. I find it uneducated to minimize the Holocaust. I find it uneducated to use a television platform to attack the character of elected officials while hiding behind celebrity privilege. The studio was completely silent now, everyone absorbing the devastating exposure of Whoopi's hypocrisy. This wasn't just about policy differences anymore. This was about fundamental moral authority and who had the right to judge others. And you know what I find dangerous? Boebert continued, her voice carrying the weight of righteous indignation. I find it dangerous that millions of Americans get their political opinions from someone who thinks child rape isn't rape. I find it dangerous that our culture elevates the opinions of people who consistently defend the indefensible. She began gathering her papers, preparing to leave, but she wasn't finished. I represent 760,000 people in Colorado's 3rd District. They chose me to be their voice in Congress. They hold me accountable every day through emails, phone calls, town halls, and ultimately through elections. She looked around the studio one final time. You represent nobody but yourself and your network's ratings. You're accountable to nobody but your corporate bosses. You've never had to defend your positions to voters, never had to live with the consequences of your opinions, never had to face the people affected by the policies you promote. The contrast between democratic representation and celebrity opinion-making was stark and undeniable. So Whoopi, Boebert said, standing up and preparing to leave, the next time you want to lecture someone about education, maybe you should educate yourself about the Holocaust. The next time you want to question someone's moral judgment, maybe you should examine your own history of defending child rapists. And the next time you want to call someone dangerous, maybe you should look in the mirror and ask yourself who's really causing harm to American discourse. She walked toward the exit, but her final words would echo in that studio long after she was gone. I'll keep fighting for the working families who elected me, who trust me, and who hold me accountable. You can keep collecting your paycheck for expressing opinions that nobody ever asked for, and that you never have to defend to real people in the real world. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Whoopi sat motionless in her chair, her moral authority completely destroyed by the exposure of her own history of defending predators and minimizing atrocities. Her signature indignation and righteous fury had been turned against her, revealing the hollow core of her celebrity activism. The audience sat in stunned silence, many clearly uncomfortable with what they had learned about their progressive hero. The other co-hosts looked around uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such a devastating exposure of their colleagues' hypocrisy. The confrontation between Whoopi Goldberg and Lauren Boebert had exposed something crucial about American media culture: the fundamental illegitimacy of celebrity political authority. It had highlighted the danger of allowing entertainers to pose as moral arbiters while hiding behind the privilege that insulated them from the consequences of their opinions. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the celebrity status in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that moral authority had to be earned through consistent behavior, that political commentary should come from people who faced democratic accountability, and that the American people deserved better than being lectured by Hollywood elites who defended the indefensible. The age of unquestioned celebrity political influence was over. The age of demanding moral consistency from public figures had begun. And it had started with a congresswoman from Colorado who had the courage to challenge a television host from New York with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about her own moral failures.